Hi everyone, and welcome to our first webinar in this webinar series with TD Solutions, and we've got the great man Terry Dillon himself from TD Solutions with us. Hi Terry.
Morning Isaac, how are you?
Very good.
Good to be here.
Glad to have you. So do you want to give us a quick rundown as to who TD Solutions is?
Yeah, of course. Look, TD Solutions is I suppose we support community clubs around Australia. We're now working in 12 sports across 750 clubs. It's fair to say, regardless of what sport we're dealing with, there's a fair amount of pressure on community clubs, and I pretty much consistently say there's not one sport in Australia that is educating our volunteers an end-to-end solution. There's bits and pieces here, there and everywhere, but we provide that end-to-end solution, and that's hence why we're partnering with TidyHQ, because they complement exactly what we need from our clubs. And basically, you'll hear me talk about there's a formula to running a club. So just a little bit of snapshot of my background. I worked in professional sport for 17 years at AFL level, holding executive roles, but I've been working in this space for 4 to 5 years. I'm still on the committee of my local community club in country Victoria, which is a great community story which we can touch on. So today we're going to talk about setting up a committee structure, but that's sort of a brief snapshot of who we are and what we do. So.
Wonderful. So by the end of this webinar, we expect everyone to be able to set up your committee for future success with the roles and
Yep.
structure that Terry will be running through.
Yep.
So let's run through the lay of the land.
Yeah, look, you'll see, I'm assuming everyone can see that slide. Look, there's a lot of, and this statement, there's a 100-year-old community challenge where volunteers are put into particular roles of running their club, and some of them are small to medium-sized businesses. And, a lot of people have fantastic intentions, but what we're finding is that, people are struggling to balance their family, club and work life at the one time. And the resources and the education of our volunteers isn't quite there. So what we're going to focus on today is about structure, and in terms of, and that can vary from various clubs, whether it's a small club or a medium club or a large club. But basically, it's getting that structure right, which gives you every chance to move forward as a club. And probably the most consistent issue we have, Isaac, and the people that are watching this, is that 3 to 4 people typically run a club. They're doing 90% of the work. But the actual structure itself and what that looks like, most clubs have a president and a secretary and a treasurer and maybe a VP. But there's some real gaps we're going to talk about today at an operational level. And we're also going to talk about some of the bigger clubs, what they need to have in place, because it's a big obligation to run a club, and particularly the big ticket stuff, the future stuff. And the structure is really important. But some of my bigger clubs do have a model that sits above the operational aspects of running a club, because particularly with future-proofing the club, whether it's a strategic plan or whether it's a master plan, but that's the stuff that's really, really important. So we're going to touch on that today. So what we're going to go, I might go to the next slide there, Isaac. Look, I think it's worth just showing this quickly. There's a cycle for a committee member. The average cycle that we're dealing with 750 clubs is committees turn over on average every 3 years. And I think since I've been doing this, I think it is probably even coming shorter than that. And, by the way, it's supposed to be fun running a club, but what we find is it's very good at sucking the life out of volunteers. And you have a look at this cycle. It starts in green for a reason. People come in with great optimism. It's the honeymoon period. They're going to make a massive difference. And then after 12 months, this is a little bit harder than I was thinking. There's not a lot of support out there for the administrators to move forward. After about 2 years, they really, the burnout factor becomes really imposing, and they start to think, how do I get out of here? And, for many, it's like that previous slide where there's someone's holding up that massive boulder, and the pressure that comes with running a club is significant. So basically, we talk about, and then the problem you have is at the end of that 3-year cycle, you end up losing good quality people to the club because they're just struggling to balance their club, family, and work life. And it's really a concern in community sport that the high level of volunteerism. I presented to a group at the start of the end of last year. There was 34 presidents of a community organisation in the room, and 21 of those was new. And it just sort of emphasises that the pressure and burden, those numbers speak for itself. So it sort of just sets a scene that my whole model and my business, which is tdcommunitysolutions.com, is built around one thing: successful community clubs share the load. And that's why the structure is vital. It is absolutely pivotal to take clubs forward. So we'll move on to the next slide, Isaac. So
yeah, we see a similar thing where the average committee lasts around 2 years, and
okay.
The average senior committee member is spending over 10 hours a week running operations.
Yeah.
So there's no wonder that there's burnout involved with all that.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. We find, and I've highlighted here, it doesn't matter what organisation, and this can apply to charities and all not-for-profits as well. Basically, the key component, and these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, excuse me, 6 challenges that my clubs are dealing with, and this is consistent across all sports. So, obviously, the structure and your leadership is really important. A lot of people, when they go into a role, they're intimidated as to potentially what encompass the role that they take on. Hence, the importance of explaining in position descriptions or job descriptions what they're going to be doing. A lot of their clubs, they struggle with finances, and more clubs than not do not have a budget, so there's no concept of forecasting. Today, although we're talking about committee structures, what is probably equally as important is volunteers, and how you encourage volunteers, how you attract volunteers, how you develop volunteers. So it nearly could be a dual topic here today, because unless you get the volunteers to support, you can't fill the roles on the structure in the committee to execute. We'll touch on revenue, which is going to be another webinar we're going to be touching on, but that's all about way community organisations are raising funds hasn't changed in 30 to 40 years. So people are just going back to the same old, and they're chasing their tail, and hence, obviously revenue is obviously a key component of any club. When we talk about planning and education, so what we do and what we do with yourself is educate, which is the last challenge. There's no one providing the right technology, the right education to take committees forward, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Fantastic. So we'll move on. So look, here's a bit of a snapshot. I mentioned earlier, I always talk about there's a formula to running a club, and the structure is the top left hand. At the end of the day, clubs and not-for-profits are all about people, and hence you'll see on the top left hand corner of this slide is people and structure. And a lot of my clubs do not spend enough time getting their structure right, and the coordination of your volunteer base. And there's a real misconception in the way clubs operate. Is often a lot of my clubs, they see how people around clubs, they see how hard those 3 or 4 people are working. They get really intimidated by that, and they think that if they put their foot forward, that they might go into a big black hole and never get out of it, right? So basically, it's about creating the structure that you can entice people to come on to a committee that really can make a difference. So we talk about finances, revenue, investing in your core business, facilities, and culture. So today is all about the people and the structure. So that's what we're going to be touching on. I want to drop this slide in, and most of my clubs and not-for-profits, they really battle with getting people. And I always say there's a 4-pronged attack in terms of getting volunteers. And firstly, a lot of my clubs don't have anyone necessarily doing the asking, or who's your volunteer coordinator. That's really one of the most important roles in community clubs that most clubs do not have. The second level or piece of puzzle of the volunteer structure that helps you build your structure is explain. I always talk about there's 3 levels in terms of running a club. Level 1, and you'll see in a minute, I talk about the decision makers who are the executive. I then talk about level 2, which is, you'll see is a green box, which is those that fulfill roles that sit on a committee. I have a lot of people around Australia who sit on a committee who don't necessarily have a role to play. I'm a big believer, if you're on the committee, you have a role to play. And a lot of people don't know what that looks like and what potentially they can take on. Hence, we provide these sample models to help them move forward. For those that don't know, we've been working with clubs for 4 years, but we came into the market 5 years ago. We have 80 videos, 180 two-minute videos on how to run your club. Because a lot of my challenges with community volunteers who are filling the structures is they are sort of invited to be, whether you're the membership person or the sponsorship person, but they're put into a role, but no one's educating them actually how to run their club. So we've developed 10 to 12 different topics on use our 2-minute videos, the 180 of them, and you can break them down into sections. So, for example, if you want to be the membership person of your club, there's 10 2-minute videos on how to run your membership program. So what we find is that gives some people the confidence to actually execute their role, because, again, as I said in the start of this whole session, is that everyone's sort of left to fend for themselves. You know, you come in on the committee, I've got no budget, I don't know how to do forecasting. So we provide all that education for you. The fourth piece of the puzzle, which is probably often the greatest opportunity for clubs, is that there's a federal government initiative for people that are 55 and over, pre-pension, and you can't receive a super pension, age pension, disability pension, and this at the same time. But we're finding there's an opportunity where this federal government initiative is funding people to actually help run your club, and that could be any particular role whatsoever. There's a fair bit of red tape to get through, but once you get through, these people can be paid, paid not employees, but paid volunteers to actually help you run your club. So, as I said, I'm emphasising this is a 4-pronged attack. Who's your asker? Let's explain, where you sit on the scheme of things in the club. We're going to use our education to educate you, and obviously the potential opportunity of having some people of 55 years and over to actually come and support your club. So that's a key structure, a key volunteer slide that often clubs don't really have that coordination to move forward. Yes, I'm not hearing you, Isaac. I've got you. I can't hear you, Isaac.
My apologies. Asking volunteers. You got the asker there, but getting people around the same table and getting their hand up, like I said before, 10 hours a week. Good luck trying to attract people 10 hours a week. What's your suggestion for getting them involved?
Look, good question. Some of my clubs, I have some volunteers come up to me and say, look, no one will do any work. And it's, they're all, they might get off their backsides, and, we're trying to do the best we can. And there's a real sort of strong overtone of their voice and their frustrations of bearing through. And a lot of people approach volunteers in the wrong fashion. So you need to find the most popular person, the person that can sell a story, the person that can explain potentially what's required. And as I said, there's that is nearly one of the most important roles in a community club, because some of my clubs are saying to me, "Oh, we can't get volunteers," and some people may be the glass half empty type people who are doing the approaching, and often they may not be the right person to do the approaching. And so we emphasise the importance of getting that coordination right and identifying who that is. Most clubs normally have 1 or 2 people they can think of straight away that potentially could fill that role that everyone wants to, but it's a pivotal role.
Okay, great. And just for everyone watching, if you want to ask some questions, or there is a chat and Q&A functionality, please throw them at us. We'll warmly welcome them. Back to the slides. So committee structures, there's obviously going to be a difference between these small clubs versus the real large ones. Some of the large ones are turning over and in excess of $1 million.
Yeah.
They're obviously going to have a whole lot more resources to play with than the small groups that are turning over a whole lot less than that.
Correct. So look, you're right. So I've got a structure for small clubs, which often encompasses anywhere from 5 to 10 people. Then some of the big, medium-sized to larger clubs, I find it's a little bit more complicated. When I introduce these slides, I do say to people, look, it might seem a bit, imposing when you first see them, but I often say that this is a starting point. So could take you 12 to 24 months to actually get the structure in place. So why don't we have a look at the small to medium size club that comes up. Hopefully that's going okay. Yeah, perfect. All right. So if I must have put my glasses on for this one. So there's 3 levels there. You'll notice here the red level and the present up above. And this can depend on the constitution of the various clubs, but I've walked into clubs where 10, 15, 20, 25, I've had one club that's had 28 people on a committee who all were having their 2 bobs worth. Fair to say it wasn't the most efficient and effective way of running a club. And so I always compare it to any small business. You can't have 15 people or 10 plus people making decisions on how to run a club. So you'll see in this structure, I talk about 3 levels. The red level are the decision makers. They're the executive. They're the people who hold the senior roles. And they are a pivotal part of the club. Potentially, while we touched on the red level, the one in the middle, it says executive of revenue streams. I often find that most clubs know it, typically have a good handle on their cost base. Where they do fall short is in revenue levels. But typically they have no one overseeing revenue. And when I say no one overseeing it, they might have the president doing a bit or the treasurer doing a bit, or etc. But all due respect to treasurers and finance people, and I'm one of them, and you might be one of them as well, Isaac. Our role is more about accounting for it rather than raising it. There's a real skill in raising your revenue and coordinating the people that you use to drive revenue. So I think there's a massive gap in that. A lot of my clubs and I'm steering clubs more away from fundraising. It sounds bizarre. A lot of my clubs are spending 100 hours to raise $1,000, and I'm steering more clubs towards the importance of membership and sponsorship. Most clubs, so if we look at the structure here, most clubs have usually no one in charge of membership. It's usually left to the secretary or the treasurer. They might have 1 person or 1.5 people in charge of sponsorship, and that typically falls onto the president as well, who's often wearing multiple hats. So I had to emphasise to clubs the importance of sponsorship. That's a completely different session as to what you're selling, because a lot of my clubs don't really know what they're selling, and they're selling an element of fresh air, to be fair. The membership, and all community clubs are member-based clubs. Technically the owners or the shareholders of the clubs are the members, and they have a lot of people come and go from clubs, but they don't have people strictly dedicated to driving your membership base. And a lot of people come and go from clubs, and they have passion for the club, but once they leave, very rarely is every contact ever made thereafter. So for me, a membership program is about engagement, continue to communicate, and a lot of my clubs are missing out on that. I want to look at the top left-hand corner with the first green box, which talks about volunteer coordinator. I emphasised that in my last slide. It's nearly as important as the top level where the president sits and the executive sits. So it's critical to get that particular role filled. Who is your asker? Who is coordinating your volunteers? So if I had to summarise these 3 slides, as you got the blue there, those are people that potentially want to contribute who don't necessarily want to go on a committee. A lot of people don't want to go on a committee, and don't want to go to meetings, regular meetings, but it does not mean they don't want to contribute. So we talk about the top level being the decision makers. We talk about the middle level, that they're the red boxes. We talk about the green boxes is people that have a portfolio who get stuff done. Remember I mentioned earlier, if you're on a committee, you have a role to play. So there's some portfolios and then we steer our people on the committee to our education so they can fill those boards. The people in the blue are just people around the club who are happy to contribute. I'm a good example. I help, even though I'm vice president of my local community club, I do help. My daughter plays sport in the city, and I help the club in a non-official capacity. But again, that I'm happy to do that, but it takes the pressure off those 4 or 5 people that are doing the work. So, if I had to give some tips to those that are watching this or listening to this, spend some time getting this right. Organise who your coordinator is, and drive it accordingly. So that's sort of for a simple club. I don't want to intimidate the next one. It's probably a lot to take in. Look, there's the same philosophy here. It's a bit more expansive than the original one. You'll see, and this can be adopted to all sports or not-for-profits. Typically, the red being the decision makers, but it's obviously this is for more medium to a larger club. All right. A lot of my clubs, when they see that, they go, "Whoa, there's a fair bit to take in there." And basically, I say to them, "Look, the first year you might identify 4 or 5 gaps that you can potentially fill. Then you utilise, and it may take you 12 to 24 months to get to something like this. But the danger is, unless you get a structure like this for a medium to large size club, you have that burnout factor we touched on earlier. You end up losing good quality people because it just becomes all too much. Put in perspective, my local community club, our president is going to his 20th year this year. Great example of delegation, identifying the right people, and that's often the hard part. It's one thing to appoint someone, but whether they can execute, and that's why our education is so important. But again, and finding out who your key person to drive, you coordinate your volunteers around your club. So that's really, look, there's a lot. I could talk to this slide, and you'll notice in the top right-hand corner, it explains the red are the decision makers, the green are the people who hold portfolios on committee, on like a general committee, and those in the black boxes are people who are happy to contribute, who as I said earlier, don't necessarily want to go on a committee. It's really important, and if I look at this structure, you'll see on the right-hand side, executive. It says executive football, could be netball, it could be executive sailing. You need someone on your committee that understands your core business. I do work with some committees who don't have that expert, e.g. it might be a rugby competition or a sailing competition. You need an expert on your board or your committee, whatever term you prefer to use, to truly understand what you're dealing with. So the executive are made up of the president. I often think the days of one secretary are over. I think there's becoming a lot of pressure points. We took it to finance. You'll notice here there's some black boxes there. You notice there's a black box that says the Australian Sports Foundation. And if I had to emphasise this, every single club, every single not-for-profit in Australia should be registered with the Australian Sports Foundation. I talked to the CEO of ASF, Patrick Walker. I said the biggest, opportunity for ASF is getting the message out there, and that allows tax-deductible donations. So there's lots of stuff there, but it's important. And we're happy to share these slides to those who wish to look at them and take it from there. Any questions, Isaac? Does that sort of hopefully make a little bit of sense to you?
Yeah, all makes a lot of sense, and a lot of our organisations, obviously half of our organisations are not sport, but regardless of sport or type of sport, it makes sense. And even for the non-sports groups, I was talking to a law society this morning, and this similar sort of thing could apply for them as well.
Yeah,
where talking about the legal focus points would also apply in this case as well with it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, perfect. But the key thing I always talk about, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah.
If you look at the Australian Bureau of Stats, is that often one of the biggest reasons why people don't volunteer is that often they're not asked. And what I find with some of the committees is they may ask a few people and they may not get the most positive response, and they sort of not give up, but they just sort of look, I'm better, I might as well do it myself. That sort of attitude that ends up compounding the problem. So it's really important to get that volunteer coordinator position right.
Yeah, absolutely. We find the same thing with Tidy, and utilising user roles and tasks effectively to start to implement a whole bunch of this sort of framework is hugely beneficial for groups. Absolutely. And underutilised.
Yep, perfect.
Cool. Let's wind it down.
Look, this is our education. Again, remember I touched on earlier in the start of the webinar that a lot of our volunteers are actually intimidated to come on a committee because they don't know what they're walking into. So we've now got 170, probably pushing to 180 videos, and we continue to add content as required. Once we meet with these not-for-profits and organisations, we pick out all the good, the bad, and not so good, and we use all the good stuff to help us improve what we do in terms of delivering to. So you'll see there's a separate section in there in terms of the importance of structure in getting that right. We educate in all these fields, and that's just basically giving those that are watching this an opportunity of seeing what we do educate in, and actually, rather than people, those, if you're trying to attract people, as I said, use the education as a recruiting tool to get people onto your committee.
Yeah, great.
We've actually developed this platform on every possible means, Macs, IBMs, tablets, and smartphones. So as long as you've got an internet connection around anywhere in the world, so if you're trying to recruit someone to do A, B, C, D, and E, that's our platform, and we continue to add to the platform literally every week or two. Once we see new stuff that comes across our tables, that's a good idea. We'll add that into our education.
Sounds a bit like Tidy.
Yeah, there you go. You got to keep moving with the times.
Cool. So, and just a quick plug for Tidy. Obviously, it does a whole bunch of what Terry's talking about with allowing committee positions to do what they need to do and allocating their jobs specifically with it all. Mark Thompson asks, where does one apply for over 55s for the federal government funding?
Yeah, so look, if you can maybe send Isaac, there's some basic paperwork that needs to be completed, and I'll send that to you, Isaac, and then maybe you two can liaise. But it's a simple A4 form. It is a federal government initiative, and we'll flick that to Isaac, and then you can send it out to those that require about it. There is a bit of detail in that you need to coordinate. But a lot of my clients, and it's often a 6 to 8 week process to get it approved. So, but if you're a charity and a not-for-profit, then you qualify for that. But there's some assets tests involved, and we're finding it's a very generous assets test. But I'll send you the detail to you, Isaac, because we probably need a separate session just on that, to be fair.
Yeah, we can share that one. It is a pretty good thing to sort of take advantage of in Australia for sure. Excellent. I think that's.
I've got one thing I didn't talk about today, which we got a couple of minutes, Isaac.
A few, yes.
All right. What I find with some of my bigger organisations is when they're moving to the future and planning for the future, and whether that's a master plan for a precinct or any organisation, that's the stuff that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and it's difficult for the people in the day-to-day operations of that organisation to do both. So, for example, let's just use a sporting organisation as a perfect example. You might have a junior club, a senior club, who getting teams on the field and coordinating, running a business, trying to raise $100,000, $200,000 to keep their head above water. And they're trying to coordinate a precinct, a future development of like a master plan. And often these projects take 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer, to get across the line. So what I do propose to some of my clubs is to potentially have a group or an advisory board, and it's often made up of former officials or former presidents, that they can then, they no longer want to be involved in the operational aspects of getting teams on the field and paying the bills, but their focus is on the future. And that allows those people in that next level down. You don't need a separate entity to do that. You can do it as virtually a subcommittee of the existing entity, and it allows the people operationally to continue to do what they do, yet you've got some people that have got some real experience in operations that can actually go down this long path journey, and it is a long path journey in terms of that big picture stuff. So in essence, the advisory board focuses on the future.
Yeah, we had an advisory group. I set up an advisory group, I called it, instead of a board, to take the formality out of it. And effectively, I shouted them dinner 3-4 times a year. Yep. And it was a group of ex-champions, ex-presidents, business leaders. There was a local councillor in there as well. And effectively, 90% of the time we were talking about our sport, but the 10% sort of drove memberships and sponsors and drove the conversation with club development and all those sorts of things. Absolutely advantageous.
Yeah, and that model typically applies to the bigger clubs and the bigger organisations. The smaller clubs, not so much, but nevertheless, the model still can apply, because those projects can take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of energy, and that's why I'm proposing something like that, rather than people turning over every 2 or 3 years the structure because of the burnout. This potentially can extend the lifespan of that volunteer.
Yeah, well, it could be worth another webinar. I know government funding for clubs is a hot topic at the moment, so webinar. But that process of how to get funding and applying for grants and all those sorts of things deserves its own space, I think. So maybe we'll take that one on notice for another time.
Absolutely.
Let us know if there's any more questions. Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up there. And thank you very much, Terry, for spending some time with us, and look forward to showing you our next one.
Will do. Cheers. Thanks, guys. And thanks, Isaac, for coordinating this. And I think please share this to others that you feel might be of benefit in terms of what we're doing, because there's lots of tips and initiatives we can put forward that will help everyone around Australia. I've got no doubt about that.
Yeah, excellent. We'll be obviously publishing this shortly on YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else. If there's any other questions, our contact information is there as always. Shoot us through your messages. Thanks a lot for joining us. Cheers.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Thank you.